Everyone in church has heard that Jesus is coming back. Almost no one has ever lined up every single promise he made about it. Do that. And the picture is not what you were told growing up. It is the night before the crucifixion, an upper room in Jerusalem. 13 men crowded around a low table, oil lamps throwing long shadows on plaster walls. Judas has just walked out into the dark. And the door is still swinging. The air smells like bread and spilled wine. And into that silence, Jesus says something none of them are ready to hear. I am going away, but I will come back. Peter does not understand it. Thomas does not understand it. Nobody at that table understands it. And 40 days later, on a hillside outside the city, 2 men in white will tell 11 of them the exact same thing. In almost the exact same words, right after Jesus disappears into a cloud above their heads. This is not one promise. It is a thread pulled through parables, sermons, private conversations, and one blinding vision on a prison island decades later. Pull that thread all the way through, and you will find it tangled up with a criminal dying next to Jesus on a Friday afternoon, a fig tree Jesus points to for no clear reason, and an old man face down on a rock in the middle of the sea. We are going to follow every strand you can find. And we are going to start with the one nobody expects, a nameless man, 6 feet away from Jesus, about to become the very first human being in history to hear this promise answered. We will get to him, but not yet. First the room. First, the promise that started all of it. John records the moment in his gospel. Chapter 14. Jesus tells his friends, "In my Father's house are many rooms. I am going there to prepare a place for you. And I will come again and receive you to myself, so that where I am you may be also." Say that sentence slowly out loud if you can. And it does something strange. It is not a doctrine. It is a promise between people who love each other, the kind you would say to someone before a long trip. I am coming back for you. Not it will happen, not. This is prophesied. I will come. Personally. For you. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. Because for the next 2,000 years, people would turn that promise into charts, timelines, and arguments. But on that Thursday night, in that room, it was just a man telling his closest friends not to be afraid. Peter, for his part, is not thinking about theology. He is thinking about losing his friend. And within hours, that fear will make him do something he will regret for the rest of his life. Maybe you know that gap better than you would like to admit, the space between the promise you believe and the fear you actually feel at 2 in the morning. Hold on to that gap. You will see it again before this story is over, and it never disqualifies anyone from what comes next. 3 days before he dies, Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives, looking across the valley at the temple, 37 years of construction. White stone and gold, the single most impressive building most of his followers have ever seen, and he says something that makes his disciples' blood run cold. Not one stone here will be left on another. Peter, James, John, and Andrew do not let that go. They pull him aside privately and ask 2 questions at once, tangled together like they cannot tell them apart. When will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Jesus answers both questions in the same breath, and for 2,000 years, readers have struggled to untangle which sentence belongs to which question. Wars, earthquakes, false messiahs, betrayal between family members, a desecration standing in the holy place. And then, this one line, sitting in the middle of it, all like a landmine. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have happened. Here is the part most people miss. Jesus is not being vague. He is not talking in riddles for the sake of mystery. He is answering a Jewish audience in a Jewish idiom about a specific event they can already sense coming, and within one lifetime. A Roman army, under a general named Titus, will surround Jerusalem, and by the year 70, the temple Jesus is pointing at will be ash and rubble, not one stone left on another. Exactly as he said. But that is not the same promise as I am coming back for you. Jesus has folded two different comings into one conversation, and untangling them is the difference between reading this correctly and reading it in fear. We will pull that thread all the way apart. But first, we have to go to the cross. It is Friday. 3 men are dying together outside the city wall, on a low hill the Romans use for exactly this purpose. One is Jesus. The other 2 are criminals' men. Rome considered dangerous enough to nail up in public as a warning. Church tradition later gives one of them a name, Dismas. We do not know if that name is accurate. What we know is what he says, hanging there with maybe an hour left to live. The first criminal mocks Jesus. Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us. But the second one, the traditional Dismas, does something nobody expected from a dying man convicted of a capital crime. He turns his head toward Jesus and says, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." Not if. When a man with nothing left, no time, no chance to prove himself, no good works to offer, reaches for the exact same promise Jesus gave his disciples in that upper room 2 nights before. And Jesus turns his head through his own pain and answers him. Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. No delay, no conditions, no theology exam. A criminal, minutes from death, becomes the first person in recorded history to receive a direct personal answer to the promise of Jesus' return, not some future, cosmic event, but Jesus himself meeting him today. If you have ever assumed you would need to clean yourself up before this promise applied to you, we'll sit with that scene for a second. It was never on the table for that man. It never was for you either. We will come back to what that means for everyone else who has ever been afraid it is too late. But first Peter. 3 nights earlier, in a courtyard lit by a charcoal fire, Peter denies knowing Jesus 3 times before a rooster crows. He had sworn he never would. Well, he breaks that promise before dawn. And when Jesus is arrested, tried, and crucified, Peter is not standing at the cross. He is somewhere else, hiding, certain he has lost everything, including any right to the promise he was given in that upper room. Here is what Peter does not know yet, standing in his own grief and shame that Friday night. The promise was never about deserving it. 3 days later, Jesus rises, and in one of the most quietly devastating verses in the entire New Testament, the angel at the tomb tells the women, "Go, tell his disciples, and Peter, that he is going ahead of you." And Peter. 2 words added on purpose to the one man who was sure he had disqualified himself. 40 days after that, on a hillside outside Bethany, Jesus gathers his followers. One final time, he blesses them. And then, in front of everyone, he is lifted up, and a cloud takes him out of their sight. 11 men stand there, staring at empty sky, necks craned upward, until 2 men in white robes appear beside them and ask a question that still lands like a splash of cold water. "Men of Galilee, why do you stand here looking into the sky? This same Jesus, who has been taken from you into heaven, will come back in the same way you have seen him go." Same Jesus, same way, not a metaphor, not a feeling in your heart. A promise repeated by angels to men still in shock, staring at the exact spot where he vanished. Here is what most people never realize. Those 2 men in white were not the last messengers to describe what Jesus' return looks like. Decades later, on a rocky island called Patmos in the middle of the Aegean Sea, an old man will fall face down. Before a vision so overwhelming, he says it felt like dying. He will hear a voice like rushing water. He will see something no comfortable, felt-bored version of Jesus prepared him. For we will get to that voice, but not yet, because before we get there, we have to answer the hardest question this topic raises. One every serious reader eventually asks, and most sermons rush past. If Jesus said this generation would not pass away, and 2,000 years have gone by, was he wrong? Stay with me. What comes next is the part of this story most people never actually reach, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Here is the part most people miss when they read Jesus' words on the Mount of Olives. He is not making one prediction. He is layering 2. The first is a warning about Jerusalem, and it has a historical fingerprint you can actually go find. the Jewish historian Josephus, who lived through the war and watched Jerusalem burn from the Roman side of the siege line, describes the exact horror. Jesus predicted families trapped inside the walls, starvation, a city eating itself alive before the temple finally fell in the year 70. And the church historian Eusebius, writing generations later, records something else worth noticing. The Christian community in Jerusalem, remembering Jesus' warning, fled the city before the siege closed in and survived. That generation did not pass away before the temple fell. It happened almost exactly as he said, inside the lifetime of people standing on that hillside listening to him. But layered on top of that near-term warning is a second promise. Jesus refuses to put a date on purpose. Concerning that day and hour, he tells them plainly, no one knows. Well, not the angels in heaven, not even the Son, only the Father. Pay attention to this, because it changes everything about how the rest of the New Testament talks about his return. Jesus does not follow that statement with a countdown. He follows it with a story. 10 women are waiting for a wedding to begin, bridesmaids, holding oil lamps, standing outside at night for a groom who is taking longer than expected. 5 of them brought extra oil. 5 did not. And when the groom finally arrives, at midnight, the 5 without oil are scrambling in the dark, trying to buy more, while the door closes without them. It is not a story about knowing the schedule. It is a story about staying ready when you do not. He tells another one right after it. A man goes on a long journey and leaves money with 3 servants to manage while he is gone. 5 bags of gold to one. 2 to another, 1 to the last. 2 of them put the money to work and double it. The third buries his in the ground out of fear, and does nothing with it at all, when the master finally returns. And the story never says exactly when. The 2 who worked are welcomed in with the words every servant in that culture longed to hear. Well done, good and faithful servant. The third is not. Notice what both stories have in common. Neither one is about predicting a date. Both are about the space in between, what you do with the waiting. Here is where that fig tree from the very beginning of this video finally comes back. In the same conversation on the Mount of Olives, Jesus points at an ordinary tree and says, when its branches become tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see all these things, you know that it is near. Right at the door, he is not handing his disciples a calendar. He is handing you a skill, the ability to read the season you are standing in, without ever needing to know the exact date the fruit will finally arrive. And that waiting is not abstract. Paul, writing to a small, frightened church in the Greek city of Thessalonica, maybe 20 years after the resurrection, tells them plainly that believers who have already died will not be left behind. The Lord himself will come down from heaven, he writes, with a loud command, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Paul uses a specific Greek word here that Roman citizens would have recognized instantly, parousia. It was the official term for the arrival of an emperor into a city, the moment the whole population turned out to line the streets. Paul takes that word, the word for a king's grand entrance, and hands it to grieving, ordinary people burying their loved ones, and tells them, that is what is coming for you. The stakes climb every time this promise is repeated. In the upper room, it was personal. I am coming back for you. On the cross, it widened to include a dying criminal with nothing to offer. On the Mount of Olives, it widened again to a warning about an entire city and a temple that would fall. And in Paul's letter, it widens one more time to everyone who has ever died in faith. An entire scattered, buried, grieving family of believers. Across every generation, all promised the same return. If this is landing for you, stay with me. Because what comes next is not a warning. It is the moment this whole promise stops being something Jesus talked about and becomes something one of his closest friends actually watched happen. Decades after everyone assumed he was only speaking of the past. The man's name is John. Decades earlier, He was young enough to lean his head against Jesus' chest at that same upper room table where this whole story started. He watched Peter deny Jesus. He stood near the cross when almost no one else would. He ran to the empty tomb ahead of Peter and outran him, and now he is old. The last one left. Every other person from that room is gone. Old tradition says the Roman authorities exiled him to a rocky, wind-scraped island in the Aegean Sea called Patmos, a place used for prisoners no one expected to hear from again. And there, alone on a Sunday, John hears a voice behind him. Loud, he says, like a trumpet. He turns to see who is speaking. What he describes next does not sound like the gentle teacher from Galilee. Eyes like blazing fire, a voice like the roar of rushing waters, a face shining like the sun at full strength. John, who once leaned casually against this same man's chest and asked him quiet questions over dinner, falls at his feet like a dead man, and the voice says, "Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever." This is the same promise, the exact same one, made in that upper room. Decades before, "I will come again and receive you to myself." Except now, John is not hearing it from a friend across a dinner table. He is seeing it. The waiting has not erased the promise. It has revealed what the promise actually was underneath the whole time. We'll think about how long John carried that promise before he ever saw it fulfilled like this. Decades. An entire lifetime of losing friends, watching the church he loved get scattered and persecuted, wondering perhaps in his own quiet 2 a.m. moments whether any of it was still coming. You are allowed to carry a promise that long too. You are allowed to still be waiting. The earliest Christians did not treat this promise as a distant theological footnote either. In one of the oldest surviving Christian documents outside the New Testament itself, a short manual of church life called the Didache, believers close their shared meal together with a single word prayed out loud in Aramaic. Maranatha, our Lord, come. Not our Lord will come. Someday, eventually. Come now. It was a greeting. It was a prayer said with full mouths and open hands by people who genuinely expected to see him. Here is the human weight underneath all of this. The part every single one of us already understands even if we have never opened a Bible. You already know what it feels like to wait for someone you love to come back. Maybe it was standing at an arrival's gate, scanning every face in a crowd for the one that matters, refusing to leave even after the flight lands, and half the people have already walked past you. Maybe it was a phone that would not ring, in the middle of a night that would not end, waiting for news about someone still out there somewhere. Maybe it was simpler than that. A parent standing at a window, watching a driveway, for a child who said they were coming home. That ache, the specific physical ache of waiting for someone you love, not knowing the hour, refusing to stop checking the door, is not a flaw in this promise. According to what Jesus and John both describe, it is the entire point of it. The waiting was never meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be love, stretched out across time, still reaching toward the door. John, face down on that rock, terrified and alone, is not left there. Jesus reaches down. The text says he places his right hand on him, and John is told to get up and to write down everything he has just seen. The exile who watched every other apostle die, who had every reason to believe the promise had gone quiet, becomes the very last eyewitness allowed to confirm, in person, that it had not. So line it all up. 9 different moments, 9 different people, 1 promise, repeated without ever once being taken back. Here is what actually matters from all of it. First, the factual truth. Jesus made this promise specifically, repeatedly, and in at least 2 distinct ways. A near-term judgment on Jerusalem that history confirms happened exactly as described, and a personal, undated return that every generation since has been told to watch for without a countdown. Second, what it means for you. This promise was never reserved for the people who had it all together. It was given to a fisherman who denied him 3 times, and to a criminal who had maybe 1 hour left to live. If you think you have disqualified yourself from being watched for, waited on, and welcomed home, the entire record says otherwise. Third, and this is the one that actually matters at midnight, when the house is quiet and you are the only one still awake with your own thoughts. Every single person in this story who received this promise is now gone. Peter is gone. Thomas is gone. The criminal on the cross is gone. John, the last eyewitness, is gone, and the promise outlived every one of them. It was never about whether they would still be standing there when it happened. It was about whether they kept the lamp filled, the door watched, and the hands open for as long as they had. Which promise in this video hit you the hardest? The thief, Peter, or John on Patmos? Tell me below. Because somewhere tonight the same voice that told 11 confused men on a hillside, "I am coming back," is still saying the exact same thing to you. Not to a nation, not to a doctrine, to you. Wherever you are watching this, however long you have been waiting, however far you feel from the room where this promise was first spoken, the only real question left is whether you are still watching the door.